The morning air hung thick and heavy over Highway 27, the kind of Georgia heat that stuck to your skin before the sun even cleared the trees. Big Meech sat slouched against his Harley outside Mama Lou's diner, one boot propped on the chrome, a half-finished cigarette dangling from his lips. Around him, the rest of the chapter had gathered. Brando with his scarred knuckles and easy grin, Tank who never said much but whose presence felt like a wall, and a few others whose names locals didn't care to learn. They were Hell's Angels. The patches on their vests said so. The rumors said more. To the people driving past on their way to work or church, these men were everything parents warned their children about. Tattooed, loud, dangerous. The kind of people you crossed the street to avoid, the kind whose laughter sounded like a threat even when it wasn't meant to be. But right now, in the golden wash of early morning light, they were just men. Brothers. Sharing coffee that tasted like tar and stories that had been told 100 times but never got old. I'm telling you, the look on that cop's face when he realized we had permits for everything. Brando was mid-story, hands gesturing wildly, voice carrying across the parking lot. Tank snorted. You mean when you realized you'd been arguing for 20 minutes for nothing? Laughter erupted. Deep, genuine, the kind that comes from years of riding together, bleeding together, knowing each other's demons without having to speak them aloud. Meech took a long drag from his cigarette, eyes half closed, watching the smoke curl upward into air that tasted like pine and gasoline. Moments like these were rare. Peaceful. The world spinning fast everywhere else while they sat still in the eye of it. He should have known it wouldn't last. The scream came from somewhere down the road. High-pitched, desperate, cutting through the morning like broken glass. Every head turned. The laughter died instantly, replaced by a silence so complete Meech could hear his own heartbeat over the idle rumble of engines. Then he saw her. Before we get into this story, tell me, where are you right now and what time is it as you watch me? Are you listening late at night when the house is finally quiet? I love finding out where you, my audience, are tuning in from. Comment your city below and click subscribe now so you never miss stories about justice, redemption, and what happens when the truth refuses to stay buried. Now let's get into the story. Little girl, maybe 6 years old, barefoot and stumbling, her white nightgown streaked with dirt and something darker. She ran toward them like they were salvation instead of the thing most people ran from, her small legs pumping frantically, her face twisted in terror. Please. Her voice cracked, raw from screaming. Please help. Meech's cigarette fell from his lips, forgotten. Brando was on his feet before anyone else moved. Instinct overriding thought. Hey, slow down, sweetheart. But she couldn't slow down. She crashed into Meech's legs, tiny hands clutching at his jeans, words tumbling out between sobs that shook her entire body. They're hitting my mama's head. They're gonna kill her. Please, please. The world narrowed to a pinpoint. Meech dropped to one knee, his massive frame folding down until he was eye level with this terrified child whose trust in them was so absolute it broke something in his chest. What's your name? His voice came out gentler than most people thought possible from a man his size. Ariella. She hiccuped, tears streaming down cheeks smudged with dirt. My mama's Nancy. He's gonna kill her, he said he was gonna. She couldn't finish. Just pointed back toward the woods with a shaking hand, toward a dirt road barely visible through the pines. Meech looked up at Brando. Didn't need to say anything. The understanding passed between them in half a heartbeat. The kind of communication that came from 10 years of riding together, from knowing exactly what kind of men they'd been and what kind they were trying to become. Tank was already moving toward his bike. The others followed without question, without hesitation, engines roaring to life in a symphony of thunder and chrome. You're gonna ride with me, okay? Brando said, lifting Ariella with surprising gentleness for hands that had broken bones and cracked jaws. Hold on tight to my vest. Don't let go. She wrapped her arms around him with the desperation of someone who'd run out of options and found angels wearing leather instead of wings. Meech swung his leg over his Harley, the familiar weight settling into his spine, adrenaline already sharpening everything to crystal clarity. How many times had he ridden toward trouble? How many fights had started with engines and ended with sirens? But this was different. This was a child begging them to be the heroes everyone said they could never be. Show us where, Meech said, his voice carrying over the rumble. Ariella pointed down the dirt road with one trembling hand, the other still clutched in Brando's vest. That was all they needed. 3 Harleys exploded forward in perfect formation, dust kicking up like a storm as they tore away from the diner. The morning calm shattered completely, replaced by the roar of machines and the single-minded purpose that came from knowing someone was hurting and you had the power to stop it. Behind them, Mama Lou stood in the doorway of her diner, coffee pot frozen in her hand, watching the Hells Angels, the men she'd served with suspicion and sideways glances for months, disappear down a road toward someone else's nightmare. She'd tell people later she'd had a feeling that something about the way they rode looked less like trouble and more like thunder carrying justice. But in that moment, all she could do was watch the dust settle and wonder if the town had been wrong about them all along. On the lead bike, Meech's jaw was set, his hands steady on the handlebars despite the fury building in his chest. Beside him, Brando held Ariella close, her small body pressed against his back, her voice barely audible over the engines as she whispered directions through tears. The blue trailer. By the big pine. That's where Mama is. They were coming. And whoever was inside that trailer was about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous men weren't the ones who hurt the helpless. They were the ones who stopped them. Dust kicked up like a storm as 3 Harleys shot down the road, chasing a cry that would change everything. The dirt road opened into a clearing where 3 trailers sat in various states of decay. Peeling paint, sagging porches, yards overgrown with weeds that had given up pretending to be grass. The blue ones sat farthest back, pressed against a line of Georgia pines so tall they swallowed the morning light. And from inside came sounds that made Meech's blood turn to ice. Screaming. Breaking glass. A man's voice, slurred and vicious, shouting words that didn't deserve to be repeated. The Harleys skidded to a stop in a spray of gravel and dust. Meech was off his bike before the engine even cut, boots hitting dirt with purpose that radiated from every inch of his 6'4" frame. Through the grimy window, backlit by a flickering kitchen light, he saw her. Nancy. Small. Cornered against the counter. Blood trailing from her temple where her head had connected with something hard. And standing over her, fist raised for another blow, was a man whose rage had long since burned through whatever humanity he'd started with. Troy. Meech didn't knock. The door exploded inward under his boot, hinges shrieking, cheap wood splintering like it had been waiting for an excuse to give up. The sound alone was enough to freeze Troy mid-swing, his alcohol-fogged brain struggling to process this sudden intrusion of thunder and leather. What the? He didn't get to finish. Meech crossed the tiny living space in 3 strides, grabbed Troy by the front of his stained wife-beater, and physically hurled him away from Nancy. The smaller man crashed into a coffee table that collapsed beneath him in an explosion of cigarette butts and empty beer bottles. Outside, Meech growled. Now. But Troy, drunk on cheap whiskey and cheaper rage, scrambled to his feet with the wild-eyed desperation of a cornered animal. He lunged, swinging a broken bottle he'd grabbed from the wreckage. Glass caught the light. Nancy screamed. Meech moved like violence choreographed, caught Troy's wrist mid-swing, twisted until bones ground together and the bottle clattered to the floor. Then he lifted, one-handed, and slammed Troy against the wall hard enough to crack the drywall behind his head. I said outside, Meech repeated, his voice dropping to something colder than fury. You want to hit someone? Try me. Behind him, Brando had already moved to Nancy, his massive frame positioning itself between her and Troy, one hand outstretched in a gesture that was part protection, part reassurance. Ma'am, we're here to help, Brando said, his voice surprisingly gentle for a man whose knuckles bore the scars of 100 bar fights. You're safe now. I promise. Nancy's legs gave out. She slid down the cabinet, one hand pressed to her bleeding head, the other reaching instinctively toward the doorway where Mama. Ariella tore past Tank, who'd been trying to keep her outside, and threw herself at her mother with the desperate ferocity of a child who'd thought she'd lost everything. Nancy caught her, wrapped her arms around that small trembling body, and for the first time in what must have been hours, maybe days, allowed herself to break. It's okay, baby, she sobbed into Ariella's hair. It's okay. It's over. But it wasn't. Not quite. Troy, pinned against the wall but fueled by the particular stupidity that comes from being drunk and losing control, spat in Meech's face. You don't know who you're messing with, he slurred. I'll kill all of you. The words died as Meech's grip tightened just enough to cut off air. Not killing. Not even close. Just silencing. Listen very carefully, Meech said, his face inches from Troy's, close enough that the smaller man could see exactly how serious this was about to get. The cops are coming. You're going with them. And if I ever hear you came near this woman or her daughter again, if I even hear your name whispered in the same breath as theirs, I will find you. He leaned closer. And there won't be any cops to save you. Understand? Troy's bravado crumbled. He nodded frantically, face purpling from fear and lack of oxygen. Meech released him, and Troy crumpled to the floor, Gasping, all the fight gone from him like air from a punctured tire. Outside, the wail of sirens grew closer. Someone in one of the other trailers must have called it in. The cavalry was coming, though they'd arrived to find the war already over. Brando helped Nancy to her feet, supporting her weight as her legs trembled. Tank appeared with a clean dish towel, the only clean thing in this whole godforsaken trailer, and pressed it gently to the cut on her temple. "Police'll want a statement," Tank said quietly. "But you don't have to be scared. Not anymore." Nancy looked up at these three massive men, covered in tattoos, wearing the patches that made mothers clutch their purses tighter, and saw something the rest of the world had missed. Protectors. Warriors. The kind of men who rode toward trouble instead of away from it. "Thank you," she whispered, voice breaking. I thought he was going to." "He wasn't," Meech cut in, not unkindly. "Because you had someone on your side today. Someone brave enough to run for help." He looked down at Ariella, still clutching her mother's waist, her tear-streaked face pressed against Nancy's side. The little girl who'd trusted them completely, without hesitation, without the prejudice adults had learned. The sirens were close now. Maybe half a mile out. Meech walked to the doorway, hands visible, posture open. The others followed his lead. This wasn't their first time dealing with nervous cops showing up to a scene involving Hell's Angels. Blue and red lights flickered through the pines. Behind him, Nancy held her daughter close and whispered the words she'd been too terrified to believe an hour ago. "It's over, baby. It's really over." And for the first time in years, she meant it. The cruisers pulled up, doors slamming, officers emerging with hands on holsters but not yet drawn. The lead cop, a weathered man with gray at his temples and eyes that had seen too much, took in the scene with the quick assessment of someone who knew trouble when he saw it. But what he saw wasn't what he'd expected. 3 bikers, hands visible, standing calm. A woman bleeding but alive, holding her daughter. And on the floor, a man everyone in the county knew had restraining orders filed against him twice before. The pieces fell together fast. Meech met the cop's eyes and said simply, "She needed help." We answered. The officer's hand moved away from his weapon. And somewhere in that moment, in the space between fear and relief, between stereotype and truth, the town of Highway 27 was about to learn something it should have known all along. Sometimes the most dangerous men aren't the ones who look scary. They're the ones who stop looking and start listening when a child cries for help. The sirens died, but their echo would carry for a long time. The lead officer moved first, Sheriff Dale Pritchard, 40 years on the force, 20 of them in this county where trouble wore the same face often enough that you learned to recognize it by the shape of its shadow. His hand hovered over his service weapon as he approached the trailer, taking in the scene with eyes trained to expect the worst. Shattered door hanging crooked on one hinge, broken glass glittering in the dirt, 3 massive bikers standing in a semicircle around the entrance. And the patches. "Hands where I can see them," Pritchard called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd said those words 1,000 times and meant them every single time. Meech raised his hands slowly, deliberately, palms open. Brando and Tank followed suit without hesitation. Practiced, calm, the choreography of men who'd been on the wrong side of police assumption before and knew exactly how fast things could go sideways. Behind Pritchard, 2 younger officers fanned out, weapons drawn but not yet aimed, adrenaline making their grips tight on polymer and steel. "We got a call about a domestic disturbance," Pritchard said, eyes never leaving Meech's face. Someone reported screaming, breaking glass, and 3 motorcycles tearing down this road like hellfire was chasing them. "Hellfire wasn't chasing us, Sheriff," Meech replied, his voice steady, stripped of anything that could be mistaken for threat or defiance. "We were chasing it." Pritchard's eyes narrowed. "That right. That's right." Movement in the doorway. Nancy emerged, moving slowly, one arm wrapped protectively around Ariella, the other pressing Tank's blood-soaked dish towel to her temple. Her face was a mess, split lip, bruising already darkening across her cheekbone, the kind of damage that told a story no one wanted to read but everyone recognized. The young officer's weapons dipped slightly, confusion breaking through training. "Mrs. Reeves." Pritchard's voice softened just a fraction, though his posture remained rigid. "Nancy, what happened here?" Nancy's eyes swept from the sheriff to the bikers still standing with their hands raised, to Troy being dragged out by one of the deputies. Handcuffed, face down, still muttering curses through split lips. Then she did something that would be talked about in this town for years. She stepped forward, positioning herself between the officers and the bikers. They saved my life, Nancy said, her voice shaking but clear. Troy was. He was going to kill me this time. I know he was. And my baby ran for help, and these men. Her voice broke. These men didn't hesitate. They didn't ask questions. They just came. Pritchard glanced at Meech, then back at Nancy. You're telling me these Hell's Angels. I'm telling you they're the reason my daughter still has a mother. Nancy's voice gained strength, fueled by something fiercer than fear. They could have kept riding. Could have figured it wasn't their problem. But they didn't. Ariella buried her face in her mother's side, small hands clutching fabric like it was the only solid thing left in the world. One of the younger officers, couldn't have been more than 25, still green enough to let his assumptions show on his face, spoke up. With all due respect, ma'am, these guys are heroes. Nancy cut him off. That's what they are. Whatever else you think about them, whatever stories you've heard, today they were heroes. Silence fell over the clearing like a held breath. Pritchard studied the bikers, their raised hands, their stillness, the way they didn't flinch or posture or play the part everyone expected. Just stood there, patient, letting the truth speak for itself. Then he looked at Troy, now secured in the back of a cruiser, face pressed against the window, eyes wild with impotent rage. The pieces assembled themselves in the sheriff's mind with the click of experience. He'd taken domestic calls at this address before. Knew Troy Reeves had a record longer than the highway outside. Knew Nancy had filed for restraining orders twice and dropped them both times because women in situations like hers rarely had the support to follow through. Until today. Pritchard's hand finally moved away from his weapon. The gesture was small, but its weight was enormous. Lower your weapons, he said quietly to his deputies. Sir. Lower them. The young officers complied, confusion written plainly across their faces. This wasn't protocol. This wasn't how you handled Hell's Angels at a crime scene. But Pritchard had been doing this job long enough to know that sometimes protocol was just another word for prejudice wearing a uniform. He walked closer to Meech, close enough to read the scars on the bigger man's knuckles, the wear on his leather vest, the particular exhaustion that came from being judged on sight for so long you stopped expecting anything different. You hit him? Pritchard asked, nodding toward Troy. Restrained him, Meech replied. He came at me with a broken bottle. I defended myself and protected them. He nodded toward Nancy and Ariella. Nothing more. Nothing less. You could have killed him. Man your size. Could have, Meech agreed. Didn't. Pritchard studied him for another long moment, then did something that shocked everyone present. Cops and bikers alike. He extended his hand. Sheriff Dale Pritchard. Meech stared at the offered hand like it was a trick, a test, something that would be weaponized against him the moment he accepted it. Because that's what hands from authority figures usually meant for men like him. But Pritchard didn't lower it. Just kept it there, steady, an offering that asked for nothing except acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, they were on the same side today. Slowly, Meech lowered his own hand and clasped the sheriff's. The handshake was brief, firm, carrying the weight of mutual respect that neither man had expected to find here. We ain't angels, Sheriff, Meech said quietly, voice rough with something that might have been emotion if he'd allowed himself to name it. But we don't hit women. We don't hurt kids. And we don't run when somebody needs help. Pritchard nodded once. Then I guess today you were exactly what this woman needed. He released Meech's hand and turned to his deputies. Get statements from everyone. Mrs. Reeves, we'll need you to come down to the station. Just for the paperwork, nothing to worry about. Troy's going to be processed and held. Judge'll probably set bail, but with his record and this, he gestured at Nancy's injuries. I'm betting it'll be high enough to keep him where he belongs for a while. Nancy sagged with relief, the adrenaline finally bleeding out of her system and leaving only exhaustion behind. Brando stepped forward carefully, hands still visible. Sheriff, she's hurt pretty bad. Should probably get looked at. Ambulance is already on the way. Pritchard's tone had shifted from suspicion to something closer to professional courtesy. You boys can stick around for statements or head out. I know where to find you if I need anything else. It was a dismissal, but one wrapped in acknowledgement. "You did good. Now you can leave without cuffs." Meech glanced at Nancy, who met his eyes with gratitude so profound it almost hurt to look at. "Thank you," she said again, voice breaking. "I don't know how to." "You don't have to," Meech interrupted gently. "Just take care of your girl. That's all the thanks we need." Ariella peeked out from behind her mother, eyes red-rimmed but no longer terrified. She raised one small hand in a wave. Meech's expression, hard, scarred, built from years of being treated like something to fear, softened just enough to wave back. The bikers turned toward their Harleys, boots crunching on gravel, the morning sun climbing higher now and burning off the last of the dew. Engines rumbled to life, that familiar thunder that usually made people lock their doors. But today, as they rode out of the clearing, a few neighbors had emerged from their trailers, drawn by sirens and curiosity, and watched them leave. Some still looked suspicious. Old habits die hard. But others, mostly women, mostly mothers who understood exactly what Nancy had survived, looked different. Their expressions carried something that might have been respect, might have been gratitude, might have been the beginning of minds changing. Back at the scene, as paramedics arrived and began tending to Nancy, Sheriff Pritchard stood watching the dust settle where the bikers had disappeared. His youngest deputy approached, holster now secured, confusion still written across his face. "Sir, I don't understand. Those guys are Hell's Angels. They're criminals." Pritchard was quiet for a moment, thinking about the handshake, about the care those dangerous men had shown toward a terrified woman and child, about how many times he'd judged a book by its cover and been right, and how wrong that made him when he was wrong. "Sometimes, son," he said finally, "the worst-looking people do the best things. And sometimes we're so busy looking at the patches on a man's vest, we forget to look at what's underneath." He turned to head back toward his cruiser, then paused. "Write it up exactly how it happened. No editorializing. Just facts. 3 bikers responded to a child's call for help and stopped a man from beating a woman to death. That's the story." "But sir..." "That's the story," Pritchard repeated, his voice carrying the finality of rank and years. For the first time in his career, maybe the first time in this town's history, the lawman nodded at the memory of a Hell's Angel. And somewhere down Highway 27, engines roared toward a diner where coffee was getting cold and a story was being born that would ripple outward in ways none of them could predict yet. The world was about to learn something it should have known all along. Sometimes heroes wear leather. And sometimes justice rides on 2 wheels. News traveled fast in a town this small, faster than the Harleys that had torn down that dirt road 3 days ago. By noon the day after the rescue, Mama Lou's diner was buzzing with versions of the story that grew wilder with each retelling. Some said the bikers had beaten Troy half to death. Others claimed they'd held him at gunpoint. A few swore they'd seen blood everywhere, like something out of a horror movie. But Nancy Reeves knew the truth. And she wasn't staying quiet. She sat in a booth by the window, Ariella coloring beside her, the bruises on her face turning from purple to yellow-green. The cut on her temple had required 6 stitches, but the doctor said she'd been lucky. Another inch and it could have been so much worse. "I heard they kicked the door clean off its hinges," Mrs. Patterson whispered to her husband 2 booths over, loud enough that half the diner could hear. "I heard they didn't even call the police first," someone else added. "Just took matters into their own hands." Nancy set down her coffee cup with enough force that the ceramic cracked against the saucer. The diner went quiet. "They saved my life," she said, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent room. "While everyone else in this town has been whispering about Troy for years, asking me why I don't just leave like it's that simple, those men actually did something." The silence deepened, uncomfortable now. "My baby ran to them crying and they didn't hesitate. Didn't judge. Didn't ask if I deserved it or what I'd done to provoke him." Her voice broke but she pushed through. "They just came. And they stayed until the police arrived. So whatever stories you're telling, make sure that's in there." Mrs. Patterson had the decency to look ashamed. Others found sudden interest in their plates. Ariella looked up from her drawing, another one of motorcycles and stick figures, and smiled at her mama with pride that made Nancy's heart ache. Across town, the bikers faced their own whispers. Big Meech walked into the auto parts store and felt the shift immediately. The way conversations stopped mid-sentence, the way eyes followed him down the aisles. But this time the fear felt different, mixed with something else. The clerk, a kid who usually avoided eye contact, rang up his order and said quietly, "My mom works at the courthouse. She said what you guys did was..." Real brave. Meech grunted, uncomfortable with praise. Just did what needed doing. Still, not everyone would've. At the gas station, Brando filled his tank while a woman approached hesitantly, a little girl hiding behind her legs. "Are you one of the bikers who helped Nancy?" she asked. Brando nodded, wary. "Thank you," she said simply. "My sister was in a situation like that once. Nobody helped. It's good to know there are still people who do." The little girl peeked out and waved. Brando waved back, feeling something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Acceptance, maybe. Or respect. But not everyone was convinced. Outside the police station, a group of men gathered, Troy's friends, his drinking buddies, the kind of guys who thought hitting women was justified if they asked for it. They watched the bikers ride past and their expressions promised trouble. "They think they're heroes," one muttered. "We'll see about that," another replied. Back at the diner, Nancy opened her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. A job application Mama Lou had quietly slipped her yesterday. The owner had told her she needed good waitresses, and that everyone deserved a fresh start. Nancy filled it out carefully, Ariella humming beside her, and for the first time in years, allowed herself to imagine a future where she wasn't afraid. Outside, a Harley rumbled past. The sound that used to make her flinch now sounded almost like protection. The town was whispering. But the story was changing. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, slipped under Nancy's door sometime during the night when the world was dark and sleeping. She found it when she stumbled to the kitchen for coffee, still half asleep, Ariella's soft breathing drifting from the bedroom they now shared. Nancy refused to let her daughter sleep alone anymore. Plain white envelope. No stamp. No return address. Just her name scrawled across the front in handwriting she recognized immediately. Her hands shook as she opened it. "You think you won? You think some bikers scare me? I'm coming back for what's mine. You and that brat. Count on it." The coffee cup slipped from her fingers, shattering against the linoleum in an explosion of ceramic and dark liquid that looked too much like the blood she'd scrubbed from this floor a week ago. Across town, Big Meech noticed them first, a rusted pickup truck that had been parked across from his motel room for 3 days straight. Different guys sitting in it at different times, but always watching. Always there. He mentioned it to Brando over breakfast at Mama Lou's. "Troy's friends," Brando said, not a question. "They're making noise around town too. Talking about how we disrespected them. How we had no right." Tank, silent as always, slid his phone across the table. A Facebook post from one of Troy's buddies. "Angels think they run this town now. Time to clip some wings." Meech's jaw tightened. He'd been in enough conflicts to recognize the pattern. Posturing before action, threats before violence. These guys were working themselves up to something. "We need to check on Nancy," he said, already standing. They found her at the trailer, door locked, curtains drawn, the letter crumpled on the kitchen table. Ariella sat in the corner with her coloring books, too quiet, that freshly earned peace already dissolving. Nancy's eyes were red when she answered Meech's knock, chain lock still engaged until she recognized him. "He's out on bail," she said, voice hollow. "His brother posted it yesterday. And this morning." She handed him the letter. Meech read it once. Twice. The paper crumpled in his fist. "You're not staying here," he said flatly. "I can't afford anywhere else. And I just started at the diner." "Then we stay," Brando interrupted. "Shifts. Someone's always nearby." Nancy started to protest, pride and fear warring on her face. But Tank was already checking the windows, testing the locks, his silence somehow more reassuring than any words. "You don't have to," she began. "We do," Meech said simply. "Because if we don't, and something happens, we'll never forgive ourselves. And because," he glanced at Ariella, who was watching them with those two old eyes, "she trusted us once. We don't break that trust." That night, a Harley was parked outside Nancy's trailer. And the next night. And the night after that. The bikers rotated shifts. Meech taking evenings, Brando the late nights, Tank the early mornings. They didn't make a show of it, didn't advertise their presence. Just sat on their bikes, visible, a silent promise to anyone watching. But Troy's friends were watching too. On the fourth night, bottles smashed against Meech's motel room window at 2 a.m. He was outside in seconds, but the pickup was already tearing away, laughter echoing in the darkness. The message was clear. "We know where you sleep." Brando's tires were slashed 2 days later. Tank got jumped behind the gas station. 3-on-1, pipes and chains. He held his own, left two of them bleeding, but the intent was unmistakable. This was escalating. Sheriff Pritchard pulled Meech aside after responding to Tank's assault report. "I can't give you protection," he said quietly. "Department stretched thin and technically, you boys aren't locals. But off the record." He met Meech's eyes. "Watch your backs. Troy's got friends in places I can't reach, and they're not happy about what happened." "We can handle ourselves," Meech replied. "I know you can. But that woman and her kid can't. You understand what I'm saying?" Meech understood perfectly. That night, more bikers arrived. Brothers from other chapters, called in by a single phone call that said only, "Need backup. Family business. No questions asked." That's how it worked. By week's end, 5 Harleys circled Nancy's trailer each night, engines rumbling like thunder promising lightning. The shadows had returned. But this time, they'd brought their own darkness to fight back. Troy was coming. They all knew it. The only question was when. The routine settled in like morning fog. Quiet, persistent, covering everything. Nancy woke each dawn to the rumble of engines changing shifts outside her window. The sound that used to signify danger now meant safety, and the irony wasn't lost on her. She'd pull back the curtain to see Tank rolling away as Meech rolled in, the two men exchanging nothing but a nod, communication distilled to its purest form. Ariella adjusted fastest, the way children do when adults give them permission to feel safe again. She'd wave at the bikers through the window, pressed against the glass in her pajamas, and they'd wave back. These massive tattooed men suddenly rendered gentle by a 6-year-old's trust. Sometimes she'd bring them cookies from the batch Nancy made, running barefoot across the yard with a paper plate covered in tin foil. "For keeping the monsters away," she'd say solemnly, and grown men who'd seen the worst humanity had to offer would accept those cookies like they were medals. The trailer park noticed. Of course they noticed. Mrs. Chen from 2 lots over started leaving thermoses of coffee on the makeshift table Brando had set up, a camping chair and overturned crate that served as the night watch station. She never spoke to the bikers directly, still too conditioned by years of prejudice, but the coffee appeared like clockwork at 10 p.m. every night. Mr. Walker, the veteran in the end unit who rarely left his porch, began sitting out during the evening shifts. Didn't talk much, just smoked his pipe and kept his own vigil, an old soldier recognizing brothers in arms regardless of the uniform. Nancy found work easier to bear knowing Ariella was protected. She'd take the afternoon shift at Mama Lou's, Mama Lou herself having decided that maybe she'd been wrong about some things and right about others, and the right thing now was giving Nancy a chance. "You're doing good," Mama Lou said one day, watching Nancy handle a difficult customer with grace that came from surviving far worse than complaints about cold coffee. During breaks, Nancy would step outside where Meech sat on his Harley in the parking lot, not hovering, just present. "You don't have to stay all day," she'd say, the same protest she offered every time. "I know," he'd reply, the same answer he gave every time. Their conversations were short, economical, built from the understanding that some debts couldn't be repaid with words. But slowly, carefully, something like friendship began to grow in the spaces between protection and gratitude. He told her about the road, about what it felt like to be free and trapped simultaneously, judged by everyone but understood by few. She told him about Ariella's father, gone before she was born, and about Troy, who'd seemed like salvation once upon a time before salvation turned into survival. "You ever think about leaving?" Meech asked one afternoon. "Town this small, memories this fresh. Might be easier somewhere new." Nancy considered it, watching her daughter through the diner window, finally laughing again while coloring at the counter. "Maybe someday," she said. "But right now, leaving feels like letting him win. Like saying I was the one who had to disappear. And I'm tired of disappearing." Meech nodded slowly. "Then we make sure you don't have to." The bikers did more than watch. Brando fixed Nancy's porch. The boards had been rotting for years, dangerous, but Troy had always said it was fine when it clearly wasn't. Tank replaced the locks on her doors, real deadbolts that actually worked. Meech brought Ariella a helmet, child-sized, pink, covered in butterflies, and took her for short rides around the park when Nancy nervously agreed. The little girl's laughter as they circled the block became the soundtrack of healing. Pure joy replacing terror one revolution at a time. The town continued changing its mind in increments. Some still crossed the street when they saw the patches. Old prejudices don't die overnight. But others nodded, offered tight smiles, began to understand that maybe danger and protection weren't as far apart as they'd thought. At the hardware store, the owner asked Brando for advice on motorcycle maintenance. At the library, Ariella dragged Tank inside to help her find books about engines. Because I want to ride one like you someday. At the diner, regulars stopped staring and started nodding hello. Small victories. Quiet revolutions. But under the surface, Troy's friends still circled, still watched, still whispered promises of violence in bars where nobody wore badges or asked questions. Sheriff Pritchard stopped by the trailer one evening, pulling Meech aside. Troy filed a complaint, he said tiredly. Says you're harassing him, stalking his property. I told him he's full of shit, but legally he can make noise. We're not on his property, Meech pointed out. I know. And between you and me, keep doing what you're doing. But officially, I have to tell you to be careful. He's looking for a reason to escalate this legally. Let him try. The sheriff smiled grimly. That's what I figured you'd say. As Pritchard's cruiser pulled away, Ariella emerged from the trailer, butterfly helmet clutched in both hands. Can we ride again? She asked hopefully. Meech looked at Nancy, who stood in the doorway, still nervous but trusting. Short one, he agreed. And as they circled the block, the little girl's laughter echoing across a trailer park that had seen too much sadness, the other bikers watched and understood exactly what they were protecting. Not just a woman. Not just a child. Hope. Second chances. The possibility that monsters could be kept away and heroes could wear leather. The roadside guardians kept their watch. The storm was coming, but they'd be ready. Troy came back on a Thursday, drunk and furious, the restraining order apparently meaning nothing when rage burned hot enough. Nancy heard the truck first, that familiar engine knock she'd learned to fear, the sound that used to send her scrambling to hide evidence of imagined transgressions. But this time she didn't scramble. She grabbed Ariella, pulled her into the bedroom closet with practiced efficiency born from too many previous emergencies, and dialed 911 with shaking hands. Stay quiet, baby, she whispered. Just like we practiced. Then she called Meech. He answered on the first ring. Nancy. He's here. He's. The sound of splintering would cut her off. The new deadbolt tank had installed held for 3 kicks. Then gave way. Oh God, he's inside. Lock the bedroom door. We're 2 minutes out. But 2 minutes might as well have been hours when Troy was already screaming her name, already throwing furniture, already promising all the things he'd do when he found her. Nancy, you think you can embarrass me? You think you can hide behind those bikers forever? In the closet, Ariella pressed her face into her mother's shoulder, small body trembling. Nancy held her, one hand over her daughter's ear, her own heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. The bedroom door handle rattled, twisted. Then Troy's shoulder hit the wood with a crash that made the whole trailer shake. Once. Twice. On the third hit, the door frame cracked. Nancy closed her eyes and prayed to a God she'd stopped believing in years ago, bargaining with all the fervor of someone who had nothing left to offer but desperate hope. Then she heard it. The sound of salvation arriving on 2 wheels. Engines. Multiple engines. The roar of Harleys tearing into the trailer park at speeds that scattered gravel and drew every neighbor to their windows. Troy heard them too. Through the splintered door, Nancy saw his silhouette freeze, saw him turn toward the window, saw the moment he realized he'd made a terrible mistake. Meech didn't knock this time either. He hit the already damaged front door at a dead run, and what was left of it exploded inward under 6'4" of focused fury. Troy spun, tried to defend himself, but the alcohol made him clumsy and the rage made him stupid. He swung wild. Meech ducked low, came up inside the arc, and delivered a body shot that folded Troy in half. Bedroom, Brando said from behind him, already moving past. Troy, wheezing, tried to grab for something. A lamp, a chair leg, anything. But Meech caught his wrist and twisted, the same motion he'd used the first time. This time, though, there was less restraint. More conviction. You don't learn, do you? Meech's voice was cold, empty of everything except certainty. "Nancy, you okay?" Her voice cracked. "We're in the closet." Brando opened the bedroom door gently, despite the fact his hands had just helped restrain a violent drunk. "It's safe now, ma'am. You can come out." Nancy emerged slowly. Ariella clutched against her chest, both of them shaking. When she saw Troy, face down on the floor, Meech's knee in his back, Tank zip-tying his wrists with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before, something broke in her. Not in a bad way. In the way that dams break when they've held back too much pressure for too long. She started crying. Not from fear this time, but from relief so overwhelming it had nowhere else to go. From gratitude. From the realization that for the first time in 5 years, she'd fought back. She'd called for help and help had come. "You broke the restraining order," Meech said to Troy, voice flat. "You broke into her home. You threatened her and her child. And this time, there's 6 witnesses." Through the window, neighbors stood watching. Mrs. Chen with her phone out recording, Mr. Walker on his porch with his arms crossed, others gathering with the particular energy of people who'd finally decided which side they were on. Sirens approached, growing louder. Faster response time than last time. Maybe because Nancy had screamed into the phone that her abuser was back, or maybe because someone at the station remembered what happened last time and decided this woman had been through enough. Sheriff Pritchard arrived with 3 cruisers, more backup than necessary, except it wasn't really backup. It was a statement. He walked into the trailer, took in the scene, the restrained Troy, the bikers standing calm with hands visible, the woman crying with relief instead of fear, and shook his head. "Troy Reeves," he said wearily, "you are under arrest for violation of a restraining order, breaking and entering, and assault. You have the right to remain silent, and I suggest you exercise it because I am not in the mood for your excuses." Troy, being Troy, didn't remain silent. He screamed about rights and injustice and how this was all Nancy's fault anyway. And with each word, the deputy's grips on his arms tightened just a fraction more than necessary. As they dragged him out, he locked eyes with Nancy. Tried one last time to make her feel small, afraid, responsible for his choices. But Nancy, standing between Big Meech and Brando, Ariella clutched tight against her, didn't look away. For the first time in 5 years, she met his gaze and didn't flinch. And Troy Reeves, in that moment, realized he'd lost something he could never take back. Her fear. The cruiser doors slammed. The sirens faded. The neighbors slowly dispersed, though Mrs. Chen lingered long enough to say to Nancy, "You did good, honey. Real good." In the ruins of the trailer, broken door, splintered furniture, the wreckage of violence interrupted. Nancy finally set Ariella down and turned to face the bikers. "Thank you," she said, voice steady now. "I don't know how to ever." "You already did," Meech interrupted gently. "You called. You fought. You protected your daughter. We just backed you up." Through the broken doorway, the sun was setting over Highway 27, painting everything gold and red. The storm had passed. For real this time. And in its wake, something stronger remained. The courthouse smelled like old wood and justice delayed. That particular scent of bureaucracy moving at its own pace while lives hung in the balance. Nancy sat on the bench outside courtroom 3, hands folded in her lap. Ariella beside her swinging her legs and humming softly. They'd been waiting for an hour, the preliminary hearing running long, time stretching like taffy. Down the hall, Big Meech leaned against the wall, arms crossed. Brando and Tank flanked him, a silent wall of leather and loyalty. They didn't have to be here, their statements had already been given, notarized, filed in triplicate. But they came anyway. "You nervous?" Brando asked Nancy during one of the recesses. "Terrified," she admitted. But not of him anymore. Of, what if they don't believe me? What if his lawyer makes me sound like I'm lying or exaggerating or... "Then we tell them what we saw," Meech said simply. "Truth doesn't change based on how good someone's lawyer is." The courtroom doors opened. A bailiff called Nancy's name. She stood, smoothed her dress, borrowed from Mama Lou, the nicest thing she'd worn in years, and looked down at Ariella. "You stay with Meech, okay, baby?" Ariella nodded, then surprised everyone by reaching up and taking Meech's massive hand in her tiny one. The big man looked down at this small act of trust and something in his expression softened. "We got her," he said. You go tell your truth. Inside, the courtroom was smaller than Nancy expected but somehow more intimidating. Troy sat at the defendant's table, his lawyer, some public defender who looked fresh out of law school and already exhausted, whispering instructions he clearly wasn't following. When Troy saw Nancy, he smirked. Tried to intimidate her one more time with that look that used to make her apologize for things that weren't her fault. Nancy looked right through him and took her seat in the witness box. The prosecutor, a woman named Margaret Chen, no relation to the neighbor, but the coincidence felt like fate, approached with gentle efficiency. Mrs. Reeves, can you tell the court what happened on the evening of October 10th? Nancy took a breath. Then she told them everything. Not just about that night, but about all of it. The years of escalation, the threats, the time she'd almost left but had nowhere to go. The restraining order she'd filed and Troy had violated. The sound of Ariella crying in the closet while her mother prayed someone would hear. She told them about the bikers. About how a child had run to strangers for help and those strangers had come. About how they'd protected her. Not once but twice. About how they'd stayed when everyone else in this town had looked the other way for years. Those men, Nancy said, her voice steady now, strengthened by truth, saved my life. They didn't know me. Didn't owe me anything. But they came anyway. And they stayed. And because of them, my daughter still has a mother. Troy's lawyer tried to interject, to paint the bikers as vigilantes, as dangerous elements who'd taken the law into their own hands. Margaret Chen shut him down with precedent and calm authority. The defendants acted within their rights to prevent imminent harm. Law enforcement has confirmed this. Sheriff Pritchard himself commended their actions. And then Sheriff Pritchard testified, still in uniform, speaking with the weight of 4 decades in law enforcement. In my professional opinion, he said, looking directly at the judge, those men did what I would have wanted any decent person to do. They protected someone who couldn't protect herself. They showed restraint when they could have shown violence. And they stayed within the boundaries of the law while doing it. The judge, an older woman with silver hair and eyes that had seen too many cases exactly like this one, listened carefully. When both sides had finished, she took off her glasses and addressed Troy directly. Mr. Reeves, you violated a restraining order. You broke into Ms. Reeves' home with intent to cause harm. You terrorized a woman and child. The evidence is overwhelming, and your history speaks for itself. She paused, letting the words settle. You're remanded to county jail pending trial. Bail is denied. And if I ever see you in front of me again, I will throw every book I have at you. Do you understand? Troy opened his mouth, closed it, nodded once, all the bravado finally draining away. As for Ms. Reeves, the judge continued, her tone softening, I'm granting a permanent restraining order. And I'm also ordering that victim services connect you with resources for housing, counseling, and legal aid. You've shown remarkable courage today. Nancy's eyes filled with tears, but these were different from all the ones before. Not fear or pain, but relief so profound it felt like breathing for the first time. Outside the courtroom, Ariella launched herself at her mother with enough force to nearly knock her over. Did we win, Mama? Yeah, baby, Nancy whispered into her daughter's hair. We won. The bikers stood nearby, respectful distance, ready to leave now that their part was done. But Nancy walked over, Ariella's hand in hers, and did something that surprised everyone. She hugged Big Meech. Just walked right up to this massive tattooed man that most people cross streets to avoid, and hugged him. After a moment of stunned stillness, Meech's arms came up and returned it. Careful, gentle, the embrace of someone who understood exactly how much courage it took for her to trust again. Thank you, Nancy said simply. For everything. You did the hard part, Meech replied. We just backed your play. In the courthouse hallway, the local paper's photographer captured a moment that would run on the front page the next morning. Nancy and Ariella standing with the 3 bikers, all of them smiling, the caption reading simply, Angels of Highway 27. The town would talk about that photo for years. About how wrong they'd been. About how right they could be when they tried. The lawman had nodded at the Hells Angels. The judge had called them heroes. And in a small Georgia town where reputations usually died slow, painful deaths, this one transformed overnight. Because truth, when finally told, has a way of rewriting everything that came before. 3 weeks later, the morning broke soft and golden over Highway 27. Nancy woke in her new apartment. Nothing fancy, but it was hers, paid for partly by the Victim Services Fund and partly by tips from the diner where she'd been promoted to head waitress. The locks worked. The windows opened. And most importantly, Troy didn't know where it was. Ariella's room had walls she'd decorated herself. Crayon drawings covering every surface, a collection of motorcycles and stick figures and hearts that told the story of their new life better than any words could. They were healing. Slowly. The way bones knit back together after breaking. Painful at first, then gradually stronger than before. Today was Saturday, which meant pancakes at Mama Lou's. It had become their tradition, mother and daughter claiming the same booth by the window, watching the world wake up over coffee and orange juice. The bikers often stopped by, not as guards anymore, but as friends. The shift had been gradual, natural, the way protection transforms into genuine care when given enough time. If you believe that true strength isn't found in wealth or power, Nancy and but in the grace to rise after you've been pushed down, Meech said, like his usual economy of words. Subscribe now for more stories like this that prove dignity defeats cruelty. Ariella chirped, and truth always finds its way to light. Brando. Also check out her 2 videos showing on the screen right now, paper folded into crafted quarters. The kind of secretive excitement that only children can radiate. They ordered pancakes for Ariella, eggs and bacon for everyone else. Coffee that Mama Lou poured with her usual gruff affection that had replaced her earlier suspicion. "You boys keeping out of trouble?" she asked, and there was humor in it now instead of accusation.